Something strange happens to an empath right before they become unstoppable. They get quiet, not the kind of quiet that comes from being beaten down or giving up. A different kind, the kind where you can feel the air around them change. People who knew them before start saying things like, "Something's off," or "They've changed," or "I don't recognize them anymore." And they're right. The person standing in front of them isn't the same person, because the empath who reaches this final stage has undergone a psychological transformation so complete that the human being who emerges operates on an entirely different frequency than the one who entered. Carl Jung studied this transformation across decades of clinical work, and what he found made him rethink everything he believed about sensitivity, power, and what becomes possible when someone who has spent their entire life feeling everything finally learns to convert that feeling into something the world has no defense against. Jung didn't use the word unstoppable casually. He was a psychiatrist, not a motivational speaker. But when he observed empaths who had passed through every stage of suffering, every layer of self-abandonment, every cycle of giving themselves away until there was nothing left, and then rebuilt from that emptiness, he recognized something in them that he couldn't find adequate clinical language for. These people hadn't just healed, they hadn't just recovered. They had become something that didn't fit neatly into his existing categories. They possessed a combination of deep perception and absolute self-possession that made them functionally immune to the dynamics that had once destroyed them. They could still feel everything, but nothing could move them from their center. And that combination, that paradox of total sensitivity with total stability, was what Jung came to recognize as the final stage. Today I'm going to walk you through what Jung discovered about this stage, what actually happens inside an empath's psychology when they cross this threshold, why most empaths never reach it, and what keeps them trapped one stage below, and what the world looks like from the other side of this transformation, when you finally arrived at the version of yourself that nothing and no one can dismantle. To understand what makes this stage different from everything that came before, you have to understand what Jung observed about the empath's entire journey, because the final stage doesn't appear out of nowhere. It's built on top of every painful thing that came before it, and without those earlier stages, it can't exist. Jung saw empaths move through a progression that looked, from the outside, like a slow-motion disaster. The first stage was unconscious absorption, where the empath didn't even know they were absorbing everyone else's emotional reality. They just thought life was overwhelming, and they were too sensitive, and something was fundamentally wrong with them. They carried weight that wasn't theirs and blamed themselves for being crushed by it. The second stage was awakening to the pattern. This is where most empaths are right now. They've realized they're empathic. They've learned the language. They understand that they've been absorbing, rescuing, people-pleasing, abandoning themselves. They can name the dynamic even if they can't fully stop it. The third stage was attempted boundaries. The empath starts saying no, starts pulling back, starts trying to protect themselves. But this stage is messy and incomplete because they're setting boundaries from a place of fear and exhaustion rather than from a place of genuine inner authority. They're building walls because they're scared, not because they're sovereign, and people can feel that difference. Walls built from fear invite testing. Boundaries set from sovereignty invite respect. Most empaths cycle between stages 2 and 3 for years, sometimes decades. They understand the pattern, they try to set limits, they get pulled back in, they understand again, they set limits again. It becomes a loop that feels like growth, but is actually just repetition with better vocabulary. Jung observed this loop with clinical precision and identified exactly what kept empaths stuck in it. The missing element wasn't knowledge. It wasn't boundaries. It wasn't even healing in the way most people think about healing. The missing element was what Jung called ego death, followed by reconstruction from the self, rather than from the wound. Here's what that means in plain language. Most empaths, even the ones who've done years of work, are still operating from their wound. Their identity is organized around being the sensitive one, the healer, the one who understands, the one who's been hurt. Even their healing journey becomes an extension of the wound identity. They're the empath who's learning boundaries, the empath who's recovering from narcissistic abuse, the empath who's on a spiritual journey. The wound is still the center of gravity. Everything orbits it. And as long as the wound sits at the center of their identity, they can grow around it, build coping strategies over it, develop awareness about it. But they cannot transcend it. Because you can't transcend something you're still organized around. The final stage, the one Jung called unstoppable, requires something most empaths resist with everything they have. It requires the complete death of the wound identity, not healing the wound, not understanding the wound, not even forgiving the wound, letting the wound stop being the organizing principle of who you are. Jung watched this happen in certain patients, and he described it as the most terrifying and liberating thing a human being can experience. Because when your identity dies, even the identity built around healing, there's a period where you are genuinely nothing. You don't know who you are. The old self is gone, and the new self hasn't fully formed. You're standing in a void. And that void is where most empaths turn back. They feel the emptiness and they panic. They reach for the old identity because at least it was familiar. At least being the wounded empath gave them a role, a community, a story, a purpose. Being nothing gives them none of that. So they retreat. They go back to the healing loop, back to the boundaries that don't quite hold. Back to the identity that revolves around what happened to them. And they never reach the final stage because reaching it requires tolerating the void long enough for something entirely new to emerge. Jung called what emerges from that void the self with a capital S, distinguishing it from the ego self that most people experience as their identity. The self, in Jung's framework, is the totality of the psyche. It includes everything the ego rejected, everything the shadow holds, everything the persona hides. When the wound identity dies and the empath stays in the void, rather than retreating, the self begins to organize consciousness in a completely different way. Instead of identity built around sensitivity as vulnerability, identity reorganizes around sensitivity as precision instrument. Instead of empathy as burden, empathy becomes intelligence. Instead of feeling everything as suffering, feeling everything becomes strategic advantage. Before we continue, check out our new guide, True Self-Discovery, with 24 practical reflection exercises, inspired by the teachings of Carl Jung, designed to help you find your way within. Click below to get True Self-Discovery. This is where the transformation becomes visible to others and where the word unstoppable starts to make sense. Because the empath who has passed through ego death and allowed the self to reorganize their consciousness operates in a way that is genuinely difficult to counter. They still perceive everything. They walk into a room and read it instantly. They sit with someone and see through every performance to the machinery underneath. They sense shifts in emotional atmosphere before anyone else registers them. All the empathic abilities are still fully active, sharper than ever actually, because they're no longer distorted by the empath's own unprocessed pain. When you're drowning in your own wounds, your perception is clouded by your projections. When the wound identity has died and the self is running the show, perception becomes clean. You see what's actually there, instead of seeing your trauma reflected everywhere you look. But here's the critical difference that makes this stage unstoppable. The empath who has reached this level perceives everything and is moved by nothing that doesn't warrant their movement. They feel someone's manipulation attempt, and it registers as data, not as emotional hook. They sense someone's anger, and they recognize it without absorbing it. They detect someone's neediness, and they can choose compassion without being pulled into rescue. The automatic reactive patterns that used to control them are gone, not suppressed, not managed, gone, because those patterns were products of the wound identity, and the wound identity no longer exists. There's nothing left for manipulation to hook into. There's no abandonment wound to trigger. There's no need for approval to exploit. There's no guilt mechanism to activate. The entire infrastructure that made the empath controllable has been dismantled, not through willpower or boundaries, but through the death of the self that contained it. Jung found this particularly fascinating because it solved a paradox that had troubled him. How can someone feel deeply and remain stable? In his earlier work, he'd almost accepted that deep feeling and psychological stability were inversely related. The more you felt, the less grounded you could be. But these post-transformation empaths prove that wrong entirely. They felt more than anyone in the room and were simultaneously the most grounded person present. They could hold space for someone's complete emotional collapse without losing their own center for a single moment. They could navigate high-conflict situations with a calm that wasn't performed or forced, but was genuinely natural to them. They'd simply outgrown the reactivity. It had fallen away like a skin they'd shed. This is what people mean when they sense something different about an empath who's reached this stage. The energy coming off them has changed. There's a weight to their presence that wasn't there before. Not heaviness, weight, gravity. People feel it without understanding what they're responding to. It's the difference between someone who's trying to be strong and someone who simply is. Between someone performing calm and someone who has no turbulence left to perform through. The empath hasn't become cold. They haven't shut down. They've become so thoroughly themselves that external chaos can't penetrate to their core. And that groundedness, that unshakable center, is what makes them unstoppable. Jung documented specific qualities that emerged in empaths who reached this final stage, and these qualities operated together like an integrated system rather than isolated traits. The first quality was what he described as perceptive authority. These empaths didn't second-guess what they saw anymore. In earlier stages, an empath might perceive someone's dishonesty, but then immediately doubt themselves. Maybe I'm wrong, maybe I'm projecting, maybe I'm being unfair. That self-doubt evaporated in the final stage. When they perceived something, they trusted it completely. Not with arrogance, but with a quiet certainty of someone whose perception has been tested thousands of times and proven accurate. This made them impossible to gaslight. You cannot make someone doubt what they see when they've learned through years of painful experience that their seeing is reliable. And when gaslighting fails, when guilt doesn't work, when emotional manipulation can't find purchase, the entire playbook that narcissistic and toxic individuals rely on becomes useless against this person. The second quality was selective engagement. Empaths in earlier stages either engaged with everyone indiscriminately or withdrew from everyone out of exhaustion. The final stage empath did neither. They chose, consciously, deliberately, without guilt. They could be in a room full of people and direct their empathic attention like a searchlight, illuminating what they chose to focus on and leaving the rest in peripheral awareness. This wasn't blocking or shutting down. It was mastery. The same way an experienced musician can hear every instrument in an orchestra but choose to follow one line, the final stage empath could perceive every emotional current in a space while choosing which ones warranted their active attention. This meant they no longer got drained by crowds or social situations, not because they stopped feeling, but because they stopped letting every feeling command their full resources. They allocated their attention with precision, and that precision conserved an enormous amount of energy that earlier stage empaths hemorrhage constantly. The third quality Jung identified was what he called integrated ferocity. This is the one that surprises people most because empaths are supposed to be gentle, and earlier stage empaths usually are gentle because they're afraid of their own anger. They've been taught that anger is bad, that good empaths are compassionate, that feeling rage means something's wrong with them. So they suppress it, they swallow it, they turn it inward where it becomes depression and self-destruction. But the empath who has passed through ego death has integrated their shadow, which means they've claimed their anger as rightfully theirs, not reactive anger, not wounded anger, clean, purposeful ferocity that arises in direct proportion to what the situation requires. Jung observed that these empaths could be devastatingly direct when the moment called for it. They could cut through someone's performance with a single sentence that was so precisely aimed, it left no room for deflection. Not cruel, not aggressive, just so accurate that it was undeniable. This capacity for ferocity, combined with their deep perception of exactly where to aim it, made them formidable in ways that people who'd known the old, gentle, accommodating version never expected. They hadn't become mean. They'd become whole, and whole includes the capacity to be fierce. The fourth quality was emotional sovereignty. This is different from emotional regulation, which implies you're managing something that's trying to dysregulate you. Emotional sovereignty means your emotional state originates from within you rather than being dictated by external conditions. The final stage empath doesn't walk into a sad room and become sad. They walk into a sad room, perceive the sadness completely, and remain in whatever emotional state they were in before entering. They can choose to empathize. They can choose to share in the feeling. But it's a choice, not a compulsion. Their emotional state belongs to them. Jung recognized this as one of the clearest markers that someone had completed the transformation. When your emotions are truly your own, when no one and nothing can hijack your internal experience without your consent, you've reached a level of psychological freedom that most people never access. And from that freedom, everything else becomes possible. Relationships become cleaner because you're choosing to be there, not because their emotions are dragging you. Work becomes more focused because you're not constantly processing everyone else's psychic static. Life becomes quieter inside, even when it's loud outside. The fifth quality, and the one Jung considered most significant, was purposeful compassion. Earlier stage empaths practice indiscriminate compassion. They feel sorry for everyone. They want to help everyone. Their compassion has no filter, no direction, no limits. And this isn't virtue, It's compulsion. It's the inability to tolerate others' pain because it resonates with their own unhealed pain. The final stage empath has compassion that is vast and simultaneously precise. They can witness suffering without being compelled to intervene. They can recognize someone's pain without needing to fix it. And when they do choose to act compassionately, their action is precise, effective, and boundaried. They help in ways that actually help, rather than in ways that make themselves feel better about someone else's situation. This shift from compulsive compassion to purposeful compassion is what allows the final stage empath to sustain their caring over a lifetime, rather than burning out within years. They're not spending their compassion recklessly. They're investing it where it will actually matter. These 5 qualities operating together are what create the unstoppable empath. Not unstoppable in the sense of bulldozing through life without feeling anything. Unstoppable in the sense that no external force can pull them off their center. No manipulation can hook them. No emotional storm can capsize them. No amount of pressure can make them abandon themselves. They've become the one thing they spent their entire life being for everyone else. A safe, stable, unshakable presence. Except now, that presence is directed inward first. They are their own safe harbor before they are anyone else's. Jung noted something poignant about this stage. The empaths who reached it often went through a period of grief afterward. Not grief for the old self exactly, but grief for all the years spent suffering unnecessarily. They'd look back at decades of giving themselves away, decades of absorbing everyone's pain, decades of believing their sensitivity was a curse, and they'd mourn the time lost. They'd think about relationships they stayed in far too long because they couldn't stop trying to heal someone who didn't want healing. They'd remember jobs they endured because they felt responsible for their coworkers' emotional well-being. They'd recall the thousands of times they betrayed their own perception because someone else told them they were wrong about what they were seeing. But Jung also observed that this grief was brief in comparison to what came before, because the empath who has reached the final stage has a relationship with pain that's fundamentally different from how they related to it before. Pain arrives, they feel it completely, and then it moves through them and is gone. It doesn't take up residence, it doesn't organize their identity. It doesn't define their day or their week or their year. It passes through like weather, fully experienced and fully released. That capacity to feel without being captured by feeling is perhaps the single most powerful outcome of this entire transformation. If you're reading this and you recognize yourself in the earlier stages, in the loop of understanding and trying and getting pulled back, Jung would want you to know something that might sound harsh, but is actually the most compassionate thing anyone can tell you. You are not stuck because you haven't learned enough. You are not stuck because you haven't healed enough. You are stuck because you are still organized around your wound. Your identity is the sensitive one, the hurt one, the one who's healing, the one who understands. This identity feels like you. It feels true. It feels permanent. But it isn't you. It's a structure built by circumstances that happen to you, and it can be released. Not easily, not quickly, not without passing through a void that will terrify you. But it can be released. And on the other side of that release is a version of you that doesn't need boundaries because nothing gets in that you don't allow. A version that doesn't need protection because there's nothing left to protect against. A version that perceives the full spectrum of human experience with crystal clarity and responds to it with precise, chosen, sovereign action. That version of you isn't a fantasy. Jung saw it emerge in patient after patient who was willing to let the old self die completely. The key word is completely. Not mostly, not 90%, completely. The part of you that wants to hold on to one fragment of the old identity, one shred of the wound story, one remnant of the victimhood narrative, that part is what stands between you and the final stage. Not because you need to deny what happened to you. What happened was real. The pain was real. But organizing your entire life around it is a choice you can stop making. And when you stop, when you truly let it go, what remains is something that has no name for itself, no story to defend, no wound to nurse, and no limit to what it can hold. That's what Jung meant by unstoppable. Not a person who can't be hurt, a person who can be hurt and remain themselves through the hurting. Not a person who feels nothing, a person who feels everything and loses nothing of themselves in the feeling. Not a person who's transcended their humanity, a person who's finally, fully, completely inhabiting it. Every shadow claimed, every wound composted into wisdom, every ounce of sensitivity converted from liability into the most precise instrument they possess. That's the final stage. And it's waiting for every empath who's willing to let the version of themselves they've been clinging to finally, irreversibly die. If you haven't yet, check out our new guide, True Self-Discovery, with 24 practical reflection exercises inspired by the teachings of Carl Jung, designed to help you find your way within. Click below to get True Self-Discovery.